Okay.
Let's see here.
There we go.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for joining us for another virtual event. We're really happy to have Meagan Jennert with us today. She's going to be talking about her acclaimed new book called You Know Her. And Meagan signed a batch of books for us. We just got those in. So I will put a link to them in the comments field on Facebook and YouTube should you wish to purchase one. We'd always appreciate the support. And if you have questions for Meagan that arise throughout the hour, go ahead and put them in, and I'll be back on screen. We'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Meagan. It's delightful to meet you. So interestingly enough, Meagan lives in Scotland, but by chance, or possibly by design for the publication of her book, let's call it design, right? Doesn't that sound clever? She's back in Virginia. And in fact, we were just saying that the University of Virginia is partly home to her, and years ago was home to me when I was reading the law. I used to go to the law library at UVA, which is a renowned institution. And we were also discussing that the Jeffersonian quad at UVA probably isn't super comfortable to live in today, but there we go. I remember touring it, but I think it was in the spring during Garden Week or something. So nobody was choking on the fires or cooking or whatever it is. Lord. Yeah, so how long have you been in Scotland, Meagan?
So I moved to Scotland in the fall of 2019, and I went there to get my master's degree at the University of Glasgow. And I stayed through the first 6 months of COVID, and then I actually came back to Virginia for a year, and I went back to Scotland in fall of 2021. So, and I've been there since. So,
wow, Glasgow. I've had a very short visits to Glasgow, but it's an interesting city. And, you know, in my lifetime, it's really cleaned itself up because now it's really quite interesting, but it used to be, you know, pretty scary.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. So, but I love it there. So yeah, it's not as pretty as Edinburgh, but I think it's personally it's my favorite Scottish city. So.
Well, Edinburgh is, yeah, it's a beautiful city and quaint, but there again, as I just mentioned with the Jefferson thing, not all really old buildings are necessarily comfortable to live in by today's standards.
Yeah.
Right. So I mentioned all that because Meagan's book, which is her debut, actually has been described. I love this, so I'm going to read it. Killing Eve meets sharp objects in this lush, savage, Southern Gothic about two women, a fledgling murderer and the cop hell-bent on catching her. So you might ask why a woman living in Glasgow has written a Southern Gothic. And so I will ask Meagan, why is that happening?
Why is that? So I started this book years before I went to Glasgow. So I started it somewhere around 2016, 2017, when I was living in Brooklyn, actually. And, but I moved about a month after I started writing the book. I moved back to Virginia, and it just felt like small town Virginia was the right place to be telling this story. It didn't really have a home until then, outside of the bar. I always had the bar in my head, but the book took me. I was working 2 and 3 jobs the entire time that I was writing this book. So it took me about 5 years to really have the time to sit down and finish it and write it. So I moved around quite a bit during that time, which is how I ended up. I think also I was, especially with COVID and kind of the political landscape of the United States and being away from home and just sort of watching that from far away, I was a little bit homesick. So that's might be where a lot of the kind of landscape description comes from. I just missed being home a little bit during that time. So.
Well, it makes perfectly good sense. Now this must be, it's either the 6th or 7th female serial killer novel. And I have talked about in 2023. And I find it fascinating because, you know, after Silence of the Lamb published, God knows when, it was a long time ago, there was a whole wave of serial killer books, but they were all male, almost always men. And then, as always happens in publishing, there'll be like a big thing, and then it'll kind of die away. And the next big thing will come along, which it turned out was the Da Vinci Code. So then we got the Da Vinci clones, and then it was Twilight, and, you know, and then it was Gone Girl. And interestingly enough, Gillian Flynn was with me on Saturday to do an event for another of those books. And she has an imprint now at a small press. And so I think it's wonderful. She's bringing on authors. But off camera, I talked to her about whether Gone Girl, in fact, this was kind of an almost logical extension of the whole Gone Girl ethos and all the books that have come, that we would get both Gothics and we would get women and rage, female rage, coming to the fore. So were you in any way influenced by Gone Girl or anything that followed it, Meagan?
Probably a little bit. So I've seen Gone Girl, the film. I have not read the novel, and I actually, once I started writing the book, not because I don't want to read it, it's on my list. I own the book. But once I started writing this book and kind of realized the direction that it was going in, I decided I wanted to write my own story, and I didn't want to be influenced by anyone else's interpretation of what a female serial killer might look like. So yeah, and I feel like that's always such a strange kind of answer to give, is that I started writing a thriller and I stopped reading anything that at all looked like thrillers because I just wanted to write my own book. But for me, the inspiration really came, one, out of a conversation that I had with a friend when I lived in Brooklyn. I belonged to a poetry meetup group, and we would, I had no money. So that was my like social thing every week that I got to do. It was free. There was always wine and like cheese. And then afterwards we would go out to a bar that was right around the corner. And one of my friends from that group, who was an incredibly talented writer and poet, he just told me a story from his childhood that really like smacked me in the face. And that Sophie kind of grew out of that story. And then it became really personal about a month after I started writing the book. I think it was the day that I moved back to Virginia. One of my friends was murdered by her husband. And then there's just so many stories that I grew up with in Central Virginia of just really sad murders. So I think I've just been like kind of steeping in this pain and grief. And so this book was sort of my vehicle to get all of that out of my body. And that's what I did more than anything, I think. And it just turned into a thriller, but that's not really what I set out to do. So.
Well, I don't think it's so much the serial killer as the female rage part that I feel has been allowed expression, not just by Gone Girl, but by the Me Too thing and, all sorts of things. I mean, there's a trial going on today, in New York, where a woman 30 years ago was raped, she claims, by Donald Trump, and, the trauma that she's lived with and all. So I don't think that female rage always has to turn into a serial killer.
Right,
but I think it's an extreme form of, expressing that rage. And maybe that's what we're seeing. But I also want to say it's not unusual what you've said about not wanting to be influenced. I've talked to, hundreds of writers, probably thousands, and many of them will say the same thing, that they don't want their writing to be influenced by anything they're reading. And a great many don't read fiction when they're writing. They might read nonfiction or poetry or something. So I don't think it's unusual at all that, that you decided not to do that. If you've seen the movie Gone Girl, the book will never have the same effect on you. It's too late. You already know how it comes out. So it was a shocker at the time. And, the unreliable narrator had existed. Actually, I had a great talk with Scott Turow. I think it was in May of 2020 when we did an event together. And I reminded him that his book, the name, Patrick, you're probably going to have Presumed Innocent. I remembered it. Sorry, it's my age. I forget titles. Presumed Innocent actually was a classic of the unreliable narrator. I used to have people stand at the checkout desk at the bookstore and argue over who was actually the killer and Presumed Innocent.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, great job. So a bartender, is that, did you make your what is her name? Eve? No, Sophie Bram. Did you make her a bartender because of your own experience bartending?
Yeah. So Sophie, I went back and forth on what Sophie should do during the day. And I guess about a few months after I started this book, because at first Sophie, I don't really, it took me a long time to really get started because I just had a lot going on. So I just had this idea and a character, but I hadn't really put her anywhere. And a few months after I started writing, I actually started substitute teaching. So Sophie's first job was as I think like an 8th grade language arts teacher. And then that wasn't really working. And I also somehow fell into helping to coach a girls' tennis team at one of the high schools that I subbed at. And I know nothing about tennis. I just got like recruited, plucked from the hallway one day and recruited. And one of the girls' dads thought, well, Sophie should be a dentist because he was a dentist and he thought that would just be so cool. And so I thought about that and I did all this research into dentistry and it just felt like it would be a lot of work. And I didn't, yeah, it was too much to take on to try to make it feel realistic. And so then I was still also bartending at the time. And I was like, I should just put her where I know her and where I know what the men also that you're dealing with are like. And so that's what happened is she just became a bartender and that fit her so well that it worked out really. Yeah. So,
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
My own experience. Yeah.
So you basically, I'm assuming that the Blue Bell Bar in Bel Air, Virginia is a fictional bar, or is it a real one?
It's a kind of a composite of a few different bars that I've worked at, I would say. Yeah. But Bel Air is a gas station, so I just took that name and applied it to a town. But yeah.
So we meet Sophie when she's closing up at the Blue Bell Bar, and Mark Dixon, a friend of the owner who takes advantage of it to constantly come in, if I recall this right. He constantly shows up at closing time, and then he wants to hang out and force Sophie to have to stay late. And I don't know, does he ask for free drinks? I mean, is it all part of the hustle?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He does.
So he's so loathsome that you'd probably, I mean, even you, the reader, who may not be into serial killers, would be happy to see Mark, get his. So did you make him that obnoxious so that we would cheer for Sophie, or did you just make him that obnoxious because he was that obnoxious?
Probably both. I think I've met quite a few people. Bartending is strange because there are those customers that are friends with the staff. So we do sort of allow them in after close, but then there's the ones that take advantage of that. And coming from the South, there's a lot of that sort of good old boy network, which sometimes can be really useful. And other times they just, they kind of stomp all over you. And so I thought that would just be a good introduction to people who aren't from the area of really what Sophie's dealing with in the world that she lives in. And then I had another, oh yeah, and for the first person that she kills, he just needed to be obnoxious. He had to be terrible. I don't think we would be with her otherwise. So yeah.
I think that's a good point. There's another comment. I mean, I really, since I lost my copy, I had to go look up some stuff so I could remember to talk here. And one of the comments says, this is a novel about feminine rage at its center, about being a woman in an industry where women are often considered commodities. Do you think that's, are they talking about what, the bar industry, the liquor industry? What industry exactly are they referring to?
I would say, anywhere in hospitality. It just felt like, I mean, it's a great job. I loved bartending. I really loved working in restaurants. I loved my regulars. I loved the great thing about the job is it's really creative and you're allowed the freedom to move around. You're not stuck at a desk and you can make good money depending on where you are. But the sort of, the downside of that is that you're, especially in the American system, you're so reliant on tips. So you really do become somebody who must be what your customers want you to be. So, I used to have men that would come in all the time. And like, every time I walked past them, I was a cocktail waitress and they would like whisper at me to smile, and they'll touch you on your leg, or I have had men hand me their room keys for hotel. It's just, there's this line that sometimes gets crossed where you do feel like oh, I'm just a toy for him to come in and play with, or someone who's had a bad day to come in and take out whatever aggression or emotion that they have onto, which is the unfortunate sort of flip side to that job.
So if you were a male bartender, what would you have to put up with? Is it anything similar? Do female customers hit on male bartenders?
Oh yeah, not as much. I think well, from what I've heard, I don't know if there is like an actual study or if this is just a rumor, but the people that make the most money in restaurants are male bartenders and pregnant female waitresses. Because they can kind of play on everybody wants to help out a pregnant person, and then male bartenders get to be everybody's best friend in a way that women don't always get to be. But yeah, I've definitely witnessed. I used to work, one of my old bar partners was a young guy in his sort of early mid 30s. And he was good looking, very charismatic guy. And the women would just like line up at the bar for Nick. And sometimes it was a little annoying because they would walk in and see me and go, oh, where's Nick? And I was like, he's not here today. Like, leave me alone. But yeah, they would cross a line. He got a lot of phone numbers kind of slipped his way that he didn't necessarily want either. So yeah.
Well, I'm sort of in a handicap here because I'm an fortunate or unfortunate, whichever way you want to call it. I have almost no tolerance for alcohol. I mean, a glass of wine and I'm done. It's just my metabolism. So I have spent very little time in bars because it's just not, also I don't smoke. So, it's just not been a place that I have a lot of familiarity with. I'm a dud at conferences because really all the action at mystery conferences happens at bars. I'm not there. And so I've often thought it was a handicap. So, I find this fascinating because it's a window into something I don't know much about. Maybe that's why the book is appealed to. Well,
Yeah.
here we go. All of us have different life paths, and it's nice. But it's nice to intersect with something that you're not familiar with. That's one of the joys of books for me, is that you get to step into worlds that are not yours.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me think. A thriller, this is also the same quote, a thriller about what it would be like to follow those dark urges, like Sophie, and thoughts when we just need a break from society. And I find that interesting too, that, if she weren't working in the bar, do you think she would actually have turned into a killer?
No, I mean, I do think Sophie is definitely a sociopath, but not every sociopath turns into a killer. I think she's very smart, and it was just a combination of too many things all at once that she just said, I'm done. And she kind of took, one of my other inspirations for Sophie was the women all around the world that are really standing up for themselves and saying, no more, I'm done. Like, especially right now, the women in Iran are my biggest heroes. And so I took that idea of women just saying, I'm done, no more, and kind of curdled it. And I think just because of where Sophie is and the position that she's been in for years, she doesn't, this is her way of handling that, which is not really appropriate, but it makes a good story, I think.
It's a good story. Now, we've been talking about Sophie, but there's another woman in this book, and we have a sort of interesting duel here. So what we have is Murph, a police detective whose new partner is called Nora Martin, and when, amazingly, a guy is found dead, they're called in to investigate. And Mark, the privileged friend of the bar owner, who drained a 300 bottle of wine, which was sort of the last straw for Sophie, when he's found mutilated and dead, there's a duel set up, right? So did you, set out to, I mean, that's the great thing about a crime novel, is you can set up that, that kind of a cat and mouse or duel or whatever you want to call it. Did you always intend that to be between two women?
Right. So I actually, when I first started writing the book, I was only going to have Sophie be the sort of character, the main character, and the character that we got any kind of perspective from. Sort of thinking of American Psycho, that vein. And then I started writing her, and I realized that would exhaust me, and I did not want to do that to a reader. She's too full on all of the time.
Right.
And right around the time that I was feeling that, the best way I have to describe it is Nora just sort of walked into the room and sat down.
Mm.
And she didn't say much. She's a very quiet person in general. And Sophie has just been jabbering in my ear since day one. So Nora showed up and I really started thinking about playing them off. And I did like the idea of it being two women because I thought about having a man detective, but that's also, we just see that all the time, just like we see male serial. And who would pick up that it would be a woman killing men? It's probably not going to be a man. It's going to be a woman who knows what it feels like to live as a woman in this culture, in this society. And so Nora, she just sort of showed up, number one, but then she did feel important to telling the story and kind of shifting where things would go as well.
So actually, Nora and Sophie become friends. Initially, there isn't like anybody suspects Sophie is at work here. And that's an interesting variation. I mean, for one thing, in a thriller, we know from the outset that it's Sophie. This is not a mystery where we only find out in the unveiling at the end that Sophie is the killer. We already know that. So the real question is Nora going to figure it out? That really is the bottom line here. And so starting them out at friends is interesting. And then you get to gradually portray how Nora begins to realize that maybe Sophie is not who she thinks she is.
Mm. Yes. Yeah.
I didn't leave her with anything to say, did I? Sorry. No, I did. I said it for you, which is bad of me. I apologize. But still, I mean, I think it was an interesting way because thinking about it, it really isn't a cat and mouse. I mean, I think I misspoke. It isn't a cat and mouse game, or at least not until we get towards the end, because it doesn't start out in that direction.
Yeah. Well, and I think they are interesting to me because I don't know. I've gone back and forth on whether or not I think that Nora and Sophie would have been friends had they met in any other kind of place. And I found it really interesting that they were both sort of they're each other's life rafts for a lot of the book because neither one of them has a lot of they both work odd hours, so it's hard to have female friendships, especially where I imagined them both sort of late 20s, early 30s in small town Virginia. Most of your friends are either school teachers, nurses, or they're married and having babies. So it's just, if you are a bartender or a cop and you're working odd hours, it's very hard to foster female friendships unless they're women that at work. And those, for a long time, those were the only women friends that I had because I just didn't have the ability to see anybody else unless they came to the bar. So I thought that, it made sense to me that they would kind of gravitate towards one another. And they're both very smart women and they're both dealing with a lot of the same things. So I wanted to see what would happen if I just put them together and let them kind of circle around each other and make friends. Because I feel like, given where they were and what their lives were, they probably would have been friends in that place at least. So, yeah.
So it seems to me you had two choices moving this book forward. Either Sophie devolves enough that it's obvious what happens, or Nora's just such an incredibly good cop that no matter how smart Sophie is, she can't outsmart her. So we're not going to talk about, because we've already spoiled this book to a great degree. But then, as I said at the outset, it's Sophie. So the whole question is what's going to happen to Sophie, not who is Sophie or whatever. But I think, did you know which way you were going to go, or did it kind of work itself out as you wrote the book?
Probably a little bit of both. I think I just had an answer in my brain and it flew out the window, but I'll see if I talk if it'll come back. I think and really the question for me was, did I want Sophie to get caught? And I think that's really where I might have gotten stuck trying to figure out which way. But for Sophie, it was, so what I was thinking of is that female serial killers are fascinating because we don't have that much information about them. And that's either because there's not that many of them or they're really, really good at what they do. And so I kind of took that into consideration when I was writing Sophie, and sort of thinking about, yeah, how could she stay one step ahead of everybody? Do I want her to get caught? Do I want, and I really I love Nora. I have such a soft spot for Nora, and I want her to be successful as well. But I want them both to be successful. And obviously you can't really have that in a thriller book. Somebody has to win. And I did know right from the outset that I did not want Nora, even if Nora could maybe empathize with Sophie's hurt feelings. I did not want Nora to turn into like any kind of killer or help Sophie out at all. That was very clear. Because I think ethically and morally, Nora is a very good person, and she just wouldn't do that. So that's probably where I was with that.
I'm going to go back to what I was saying about female killers fueled by rage, because so often the male killer, it's a sexual thing, it's a sexual dysfunction or a power thing, or it's maybe a different kind of rage. I don't know exactly, but so the FBI did tons of profiling, but it was always almost about men, about whether they were organized or disorganized serial killers. And I don't think you can, I mean, obviously this is more of a new thing, but I'm not sure that those standards can apply to women. And, make it, as you say, maybe don't even want them to get caught. I mean, I was ambiguous because I had a lot of sympathy with Sophie. I probably, if it had been me, I think, I might have wanted to really do. I mean, I have to say there are a number of figures on the world stage today where, if I had a chance, I'd kill them in a heartbeat. So I can't really blame Sophie.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I had another. Oh, yeah. Somebody was sent me, I think it was a review of the book the other day, and they were talking about that, how male serial killers are usually driven by some either kind of sexual urges or just a desire to, what I found in my research, which was really sad but also fascinating, was that when men kill other men, unless it's like a gay man killing other gay men, in which they kind of treat them the same way they treat women, men just like, it's either by accident in like a bar fight, or they just kill them. Like there's no long drawn out kind of punishment that happens. Whereas when they kill women, they just take out everything that they're holding within them on the women. And when women kill, they don't kill for any kind of sadistic pleasure or to punish someone. They just kill you because they want to kill you. And that's it. Like, you're dead. If a woman decides she's going to kill you, you don't have a choice. Which I think is probably true. I think women, I mean, that's not to say that there aren't women that cause pain for the pleasure of causing pain, but I do think that women would probably be better serial killers because we just are good at like getting things done if it needs to get done. So I don't know.
It doesn't always have to be a serial
kill.
killer. There's an author named Geneva Rose whose book just came in, and which I don't have here, but Patrick can remind me what the title is. And it's not, she's not a serial killer. She's a targeted killer. I mean, she doesn't want to like, wipe out men in general, but she's really determined to, she's enraged and she's really determined to get one guy. So it doesn't always have to be a serial killer. But I was also thinking recently that we've seen fewer male serial killers, but what we have seen is all these male shooters. So is the serial shooter really any different than the serial killer? It's just that it's much more obvious, much more likely to get caught, and they are much more likely to be killed themselves. But thank you. It's called You Shouldn't Have Come Here, is the name of the Geneva Rose book, or Geneva, I can't remember how she pronounces it. Really good book. And it's got a nice twist in it. But and then there's another one called How I'll Kill You by Ren DeStefano, and she has identical triplet sisters, two of whom are serial killers fueled by rage, and the third one's the cleaner. If you watch the blacklist, you know what the cleaner is. And the cleaner, the moral the moral problem that arises that this book hinges on is the sister who is the cleaner, who really loves her sisters and wants to protect them, has to make a choice between becoming a serial killer herself or betraying her sisters. So, I mean, it's an interesting, a really interesting and successful book like yours has had, so, you know, lots of starred reviews and enthusiasm. So I also think there's a shift in reviewers too. You know, if they're handing out starred reviews to books, that means that they too sense that it's reflecting things in society. Because that's one of the great things about crime fiction is that generally the old saw is that crime fiction cuts along the edge of social change. It's driven by conflict, and I think that crime writers are more alert to those edges as a result than certainly than romance writers, or, you know, maybe just readers. And I think so. I think all this is reflecting things going on in society right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
So what are you working on yourself? I'm assuming that hardly anybody gets a one book deal. So I'm going to assume that your publisher probably contracted for two.
They did not, but I think they have, but they get the first look at the next one. But
okay.
What am
but
I?
there's
Yeah,
an indication that you're going to write another book. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm doing a doctorate of fine arts at the University of Glasgow. And so that research is kind of tied into the next book that I'm doing. So kind of in a nutshell, what I'm looking at, there's a tiny, what used to be a community here in southern kind of Blue Ridge Parkway area that was called Sugar Hollow.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1930s, when they created the park, the state used eminent domain to buy up the land and kick off all of the sort of tenant families that were living on the land. And what they bumped up against was people who had centuries-long history of living on the Scottish borders and who hated the government and who knew how to build their houses back up if you tore them down and didn't want to move. It was their land. So the history becomes kind of pretty violent, where the state was literally dragging people out of their homes and destroying their property. And some of them were put into camps, and a lot of the stereotypes that we have about redneck people and uneducated kind of Scotch-Irish people were used as a weapon against them to really just remove them from the land and throw them away. So I'm researching them, sort of been tracking them back through Northern Ireland into Southwest Scotland, which is where most of them would have come from. And so that's been a really interesting project. But so the next book will be something about that time period of the park being built and the displacement of these families, and probably be a little bit more speculative fiction than thriller. I think there's a little bit of magic element going on in there. And but yeah, it's working with a lot of the same questions of whose life has value, how do we decide that, and what do people do when they have to solve problems, and kind of big problems that have a lot of in a small town, I guess. Yeah. So no.
No, it sounds, I mean, I used to live in Virginia, and the Blue Ridge Parkway is gorgeous. And I think it's true that very few people would speculate about what the cost was to people to acquire the land and, and build the parkway.
Yeah.
Civic improvements, eminent domain is a really tough issue to be on either side. We're having a very large fight at the moment here in Metro Phoenix about the use of, I mean, it's coming to a special vote, and now it's been determined that the special vote is being financed by the people who want to do the project, and all kinds of stuff going on there. But there's always players on both sides when it comes to to property and people's rights, and does the state or the public good override the private? I mean, it's an endless question. I mean, if you want to go all the way back, since you're in Scotland, and you can go all the way back to enclosures, which was a terrible thing. And that actually was one of the big problems in the Highlands, was that, when the big landlords decided to enclose their land so that they could farm it better or raise more sheep or whatever it was. And that was a disaster for smaller landholders and smaller farmers. And well, it's true here, even with commercial agriculture. Many small farms have been, not necessarily fenced out, but economically fenced out. So it's a constant back and forth, isn't it? And in urban places too. I mean, there was a guy in New York, what was his name? Robert Moses, who, decided he was going to drive highways through whole communities in New York City.
Yeah.
And, divided them, did terrible things that God only knows what the Big Dig did in Boston, once again. So it never stops. But I don't remember anybody writing specifically about the Blue Ridge Parkway. So that's very cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's been a push of like local historians here and local activists are doing a lot for it. And there's some like independently published little books about it. But no, I don't think it's just a history that I grew up here and I didn't even know about it. I mean, I was just hiking in Sugar Hollow today, and there's a big chimney just kind of out in the middle of the woods there. And when you're a kid, you just think, oh, that's cool, chimney, whatever. But you don't know. And I didn't ask, like,
Sure.
why is that chimney there? Who lived there before? So yeah, it's just these so many local histories that just, if the people who the histories belong to are poor and illiterate, uneducated, they just get forgotten after a while, which I think is sad. So I'm trying to unearth a little bit, but yeah.
Good for you. It sounds fascinating. Patrick, come and join us. You want to weigh in about serial killers? Patrick he has a dark side, which he doesn't actually take out on us at the store, but nonetheless.
Do I want to weigh in on serial killers?
Sure, why not?
From my own experience?
No, because you're not a female serial killer. You've got no chance. But you have noticed that there's been this kind of rise suddenly of books where female rage is powering them, whether they're serial killers or just ordinary murders.
That's true, yeah. Well, why should the men have all the fun? I mean, yeah. Well, and it's funny, Ivy Pakota's new book called Sing Her Down, that's precisely what this deals with. And while she doesn't like bang you over the head with it, there's some really interesting issues that she brings up in the book, which is that there really is a double standard in our society about, her two characters are in prison, and why is it accepted that men can have a dark side, that they tap into, whereas it's almost like a taboo in our culture to say that women can also have this dark side. So that sounds a little bit like maybe some of the themes that you're talking about too, Meagan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's interesting because there's a conversation in the book between Nora and Murph, Murph is sort of my nod to the classic hard-boiled detective. And he says something that an old boss of mine actually said to me. He was a chef and we were sitting at the bar after work one night and he said, Meagan, men are terrified of women. That's why we have to kind of subjugate you, because we're afraid of what you would do if we just let you loose. And I think that's true. And I think that's why if women do have a dark side, it's immediately vilified in the worst ways. There's no nuance to those characters. And I love mythology, and I love, if you track some of these goddesses way back to their earliest iterations. The one I'm thinking of right now is Kali from the Hindu religion. And Kali, in sort of modern perception of her, is this terrible demon goddess who just kills everyone and drinks their blood. But if you take the full picture of her as the goddess, she's also a mother. She takes care of her children. She grows. She loves flowers. She has this full, complete version of herself. But what the better story and the sort of nightmare fuel is just her wearing the skull necklace and sticking her tongue out and dancing. And it is always really interesting to me that women, I do think that there's something to it that men are afraid of women, and we see it all over the world. I mean, women are kind of made to wrap up and cover up and be quiet and take care of the kids and don't leave your house and don't get an education, and it's across cultures. It's not even just in one place. So yeah, I think there's something to that. And I think, yeah, if women were let out, I'm curious to see what would happen, how the world might change, hopefully for the better, if women sort of put their foot down and made change. So,
Well, you look at the classic femme fatale character in noir film and in a lot of the literature. They have a tremendous amount of power, over.
Right. Well, you remember G.M. Ford had a female serial killer in one of his books, and John Sanford had one that he liked so well he brought back, and then he ended up killing her. And we had a huge discussion about whether that, he should have let her live. And I mean, some of the things you're talking about. I really hated to see her going. I was actually on the side of, you couldn't exactly let her off, but then she would have been horrible in prison. So there wasn't really any good solution to the whole question of it. It maybe killing her turned out to be the best thing. But, in what you're saying, you think about Medea, but you can think about Diana, the goddess Diana, what she did to Actaeon, for example. There are all kinds of, and what's her name? Not Jason, the Minotaur,
Ariadne, and who is it? Yeah, it was Ariadne and
well, Ariadne's the good one. It's her sister that or Clytemnestra, murdering Agamemnon out of rage. So you're right. There are classic examples all over of women that the ones that we hear about, though, tended to be in positions of power, and sometimes, either were never punished, or Clytemnestra, her son, killed her. Defending his father, and then the sister. I mean, it just went on and on. The Greeks did it all. That's the real truth. There's nothing really original after the Greeks. We had that talk with Don Winslow, Patrick, a week ago Monday, talking about. That was a really great evening, but talking about, the Odyssey and the Iliad, or rather, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah, I actually just reread that, because a lot of my doctorate project is looking at oral histories and oral story keeping, and the Odyssey, of course. You have to, if you're going to start with any kind of oral history, you have to go back to the Odyssey, because it's the classic one, really. So
here's the thing to think about, that it is, so I hadn't really quite put it in these terms till Don and I were talking. The Iliad is, the story of the war. You have the two opposing camps in the Trojan War and all. The Odyssey is the story of the winner, one of the winners, but the Aeneid is the story of the losers. In Latin.
That's true. That's really,
but, and Don said, he's always fascinated with losers. So that's why he chose to model his current trilogy on the Aeneid. But I hadn't really thought of that before, that maybe people don't think of the Aeneid nearly as often as they think of the Odyssey, because it's not so obvious, but it really is the story of, what happened to at least some of the Trojans. Where did they go, and what happened to them after they lost the war? Did you think about that, Patrick? Did you think about that when we were having that discussion?
It was great. And he was talking about how a lot of the Greek tragedies are very similar to noir, what we could think of as noir. And you think about the all these themes, the Oedipal complex and things like that. And I think men are terrified of women in a lot of ways, and you see it in the way that they kind of turn women into fetish objects, the killers. And so why can't women do the same? Why can't they have the same impulses that we do? Interesting.
You don't. I've known you almost your entire adult life. I don't think you have any of those impulses, except maybe you'd like to kill me every once in a while. But that would just be from.
We probably like to kill each other from time to time. I think that's natural.
Yeah, but right. I mean,
today I try not to. Who knows?
Today's been a strenuous day. We tried to do too much too fast, and it happens when you try to do too much too fast. Mistakes are made. It was just
the thing is, the thing to consider is, what are all of us capable of? If under the right circumstances,
That's right.
Under the right stresses, what part of us would come out? You know, and
Right.
I think fiction deals with that really well.
Absolutely. You know, are we protecting, are we, you know, the whole debate going on at the moment about, is it stand your ground or whatever? Anyway, 2 or 3 shooters recently, you know, are arguing that they had a, you know, a right to shoot the guy that rang their doorbell, even if, you know, he was an innocent pizza guy on at the wrong address.
Yeah.
I think that may have to be rethought. It used to be a more obvious standard, but it shouldn't become a defense for people who are acting rationally.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I want to stay in Scotland, because I don't have to worry about that.
No gun, yeah, right. I know.
Do you
Much-
know, Megan, do you know Denise Mina? Or do you know of her?
No, I
She lives in Glasgow.
Oh, okay.
Really fine crime writer.
Brilliant.
Yeah, check her out. She's very good. Mina.
Okay.
Actually,
Yeah,
that's
the name sounds, I think I've seen it pop up on my Twitter. So I'll have to
yeah,
go look.
yeah.
It sounds really familiar. Yeah.
Her earlier novels were about a grittier Glasgow than the Glasgow you're currently living in. So you could sort of think of them as history. I mean,
Yes.
how long ago did she write her first books, Patrick? Lord, it must have been at least 20 or 25 years ago.
I think it was 98, 99, where she wrote a book called Garnet Hill.
Right.
Which won all these awards. And it was a trilogy, very dark, you know. But then she's gone on to do all kinds of other things, but including a new Philip Marlowe novel. Barbara, do you have a copy of that yet?
No, I haven't seen it. And, you know, I meant to talk, we should have been talking to Denise last, whatever book that just came out and somehow or other got lost in the works. The other reason you want to meet her is she has an incredible hairstyle. I mean, she really has a great hairstyle. Look her up.
Okay.
She's bound to attract attention in Glasgow, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. So any questions from the audience, Patrick?
Let's see. Yeah, we haven't really talked too much about who some of your influences were above and beyond the classics and things. Mark would like to know, what kind of books did you read as a teenager?
As a teenager, okay, so I read, well, one, I grew up with Harry Potter, so I read all of those like religiously. I was always the same age as him, so it fit. I also grew up near, and I had met, kind of knew through my social circles, Rita Mae Brown. So she was the one who really got me thinking that I could even be a writer ever, which was pretty cool to be around her.
Well, she lives in Charlottesville, or right around Charlottesville.
Yeah, right outside. Yeah.
Right. So she's your local writer, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, her and John Grisham is I've only read I think I've only read one of his books, but he's local too. A lot of crime writers here. And then there's 2 books that I read in high school that I keep on my desk to this day, and that is and we read them both in my 11th grade English class, The Awakening by Kate Chopin and Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And I think for me, those books were the first books that I ever read, one where women were really given a voice and given a truly complex inner lives. And they were also the first 2 books I ever read where the writing was artwork. It was just, the writing is just so beautiful in both of those books, and I could just live in their pages. So they live on my desk, and I've forced my poor Scottish students this year to read Their Eyes Are Watching God, and trying to watch them like struggle with the Southern dialect was hilarious, but it was also, I think they liked it. So we'll see.
Well, that's what we go through when we try to read Scottish, is the thick Scottish dialect, depending upon who you're reading. Like Irving Welsh is very difficult.
Yeah.
You know, but I love his stuff. Yeah, he's twisted.
Yeah.
Well, and also kind of apropos what we've been talking about is Robert Louis Stevenson, the Dr. Jekyll, that whole riff of the shadow self, very interesting.
Yeah.
Scotland has a brilliant literary tradition. I mean, Edinburgh was called the Athens of the North, or whatever it is, for, had a lot of lot of writers and historians. And the Scots have also produced incredible engineers. I mean, they've gone around the world, building the world, so to speak. So it's amazing for a small country how enormous their international influence has turned out to be. Not to mention the diaspora after Culloden, and the enclosures, which of course is what brought them to the United States and created the very communities that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, they, I think I don't know if I had forgotten or if I just had never really thought about the fact that Adam Smith was from Scotland. And then I got to Glasgow and I was just terrible at math. And I just remember the name Adam Smith from being part of math class that was torturous to me for some reason. And I saw his name on a building and I was like, oh, no, you tortured me in high school. You need to go away. But I've been trying to read more Scottish authors. And the one that I've recently encountered is Muriel Spark. And I just read a book called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which is so smart and funny and also really short. So if you have a day or two to read, I definitely recommend it. But Scottish writers are great. It's like a whole new literary world that I get to sink into.
And then you get adventure writers like John Buchan, for example, who and Sir Walter Scott, and so you get some swashbuckling and adventure stuff. And Buchan wrote some really great, but he wrote a great spy story, the name of which is escaping me at the moment, as all titles seem to do at the moment. But
30 something steps.
Oh, the 39 Steps. Thank you. A great movie with Robert Donat from the 1930s, which is still well worth watching. Yeah, it's a very, early spy novel, like the Erskine Childers, the Irish guy that wrote what many people think is the first spy, or one of the very first spy novels. But then we could probably go back to the Greeks and, figure out which one of their books is really a spy novel. Some ways the Iliad. Trojan Horse, you go back far enough. It can be really interesting. Anything else, Patrick?
Yeah, Jane Krentz, our friend.
Oh, good. I wrote to Jane and told her we were doing this. So thank you, Jane, for paying attention.
Yeah, she says, fascinating conversation. There is an old theory that women tend to murder by poison to compensate for the difference in physical power. But today's new stories show women using traditional weapons and even straight up physical strength. Any thoughts on why the shift in techniques?
Well, I think for me, one, I just didn't want to use poison because I knew that's what people would expect. But I think that it probably is true. I think we do know about a lot of women poisoners throughout history that are just fascinating people. And the other thing kind of with Sophie, so at one point in my life, I got tired of bartending and I thought I would change to massage therapy because I saw the commercial on TV that promised that massage was a great job. So I went to school for it. And the one thing that really struck me about so many of our classes was they taught us where to not touch people and the ways that you can really do a lot of damage if you don't know what you're doing or not careful, which was just, I mean, I guess that obvious, because that makes sense. Of course, you would want to know how you can hurt somebody if you're working on their body, but it was such a kind of head flip to be in school for healing, and they're just teaching you all the ways that you can really hurt someone. So that for me was Sophie. I wanted her to have that knowledge, and I also grew up in a family of nurses, so I've just been around discussion of body parts and body functions and anatomy my entire life. So I just find it really interesting. And I wanted her to take all that anger she had and really feel what it felt like to kill someone and to put her hands on someone. So I guess that's my answer for that. So that I just didn't want her to be a poisoner. So
I have a theory, which might sound trivial, but I think it's important, is that women were restricted by their clothing so much of the world, and therefore physical acts would have been far more difficult. And also women have a lot now. It's been true in the past, but lots of women are now trained in martial arts and self-defense, or they're taking yoga, whatever it is. So I mean, there's been a kind of a thing about female fitness and yoga pants whatever, which would make it easier for you to do that. Sometimes think that women who are poisoning were sort of reflecting, the helplessness that physically they were in. I don't know, Jan, we're going to talk next week so we can explore this. Just a thought. Anything else?
I guess you use the means at your disposal, right?
Yeah.
No.
Well, the other advantage, at least in crime fiction, to having poison is that if you don't want any overt violence on the page in the quote whole cozy sort of traditional genre, if people are dying from poisoning, then you don't have to deal with the really violent aspects of killing. And I think the Golden Age writers in particular, that was part of the deal. And then some of the really big ones like Christie and Ellis Peters and all were actually trained in the wars. They were, they worked in dispensaries and all, so they had actual hands-on experience with poisoning. And the only one of the Golden Age writers who screwed up poisoning was Dorothy Sayers. She wrote a book about poisoning by mushrooms. She had the wrong mushrooms. So, it's one of my, I can't recall at the moment which one it is, but an unnatural something, I think it's called. But anyway, after it was published, people who actually were mycologists said to her, great idea, but wrong mushroom. So
Where was her editor?
Apparently they didn't know about mushrooms either.
Yes, not.
Right. Anyway, is there anything else?
No, I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Well, Meagan, see, I told you we digress all over the place and you had nothing to worry about. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was a real pleasure. And I want to thank you for signing copies of your book and congratulate you again on all the wonderful reviews that you've had. And I'm personally looking forward to the book about the Parkway, the Blue Ridge Parkway. So, and you know what? You've had such great reviews. I strongly imagine that some publisher will really want to publish your next book. Helps a lot that you've been successful with your first one. So congratulations for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So don't forget, we have signed copies of Patrick's holding it up.
Yep.
And there's really fascinating issues, aside from the fact that it's an interesting thriller and thriller structure, there's some really great questions that Meagan talks about. So well worth your reading. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.